Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Taylor Lauer, and today I will be discussing the content validity of ABA language assessments and the totality of Skinner's verbal operant theory. Social communication is largely involved in building relationships, learning, and adaptability. Individuals with autism may have deficits in social communication and social interaction, according to the American Psychological Association. Deficits in language can be a symptom of ASD. Language is an integral part of complex problem solving and adaptability, and teaching language to children with autism is a crucial skill. Sundberg and Michael reasoned that these skills should be focused on because of how language leads to other general learning skills. Language barriers can contribute to an increase in maladaptive behavior, and because of this, teaching language is viewed as a socially significant skill. Structuralism seeks to identify cause in terms of underlying structures that may or may not be physically present. Structural approaches focus on patterns of speech sounds and units such as syntax, semantics, and morphemes. Chomsky reasoned that language is an internalized mechanism, meaning that language exists not to provide communication between others, but because of an underlying structure. Because practical considerations of structuralism had notable challenges, functionalism emerged as a result. Skinner noted a circular fallacy in structuralist approaches because the presence of an unobservable structure is inferred from behavior, yet the same structures are then used to explain the same behavior. Functionalism is distinguished from structuralism in different ways, including observable events are an adaptive process for an organism's functioning. There is an interest in observable events as well as unobservable events, contributing to responses, and an interest in motivation within organisms. Radical behaviorism attempts to apply a functional analytic strategy to account for simple and complex behavior. Radical behaviorism is explained in terms of functional relations with environmental events. In this, responses are categorized by how it functions for the response, such as how a reinforcer functions to increase the future probability of a behavior. Radical behaviorists are interested in functional explanations of behavior. Two subfields extended from a science of behavior consistent with radical behaviorism emerged, including the experimental analysis of behavior and applied behavior analysis. EAB focuses on using behavioral principles in laboratory settings, whereas ABA uses these principles for socially significant behaviors. ABA technologies have been implemented successfully within populations of individuals with autism, seeking to improve challenging behaviors, adaptability, and communication. Teaching communication is founded on a theoretical approach proposed by Skinner called verbal behavior in 1957. Verbal behavior was proposed by Skinner and served as the framework for language and communication as an account between a speaker and a listener. Verbal behavior is an operant and is under the control of the environment. Verbal behavior is reinforced through the presence of another person, but does not necessarily need to be vocal to be verbal. Skinner noted 6 primary verbal operants: the man, tact, interverbal, echoic, textual, and transcription. The man is under functional control of conditions of deprivation or aversive stimulation. This is demonstrated with requests, demands, or commands. Tacts are evoked by a particular object, event, or property of an object and can broadly be understood as labeling. Intraverbals show no point-to-point correspondence with the stimuli that evokes it and is demonstrated with back and forth conversation. Echoics show point-to-point correspondence with the sound of the simple stimulus, such as repeating the same words or sounds made by another person. Textual is a visual or tactile stimuli, such as using pictures, symbols, letters, braille. Transcription creates a visual stimulus and is demonstrated by writing. Mans have been extensively researched and are often the first verbal operant targeted for increase. Albert and colleagues taught children different behavior chains, then removed a required piece of the chain to manipulate the establishing operation to build a manding repertoire. Teaching tax has also been supported by the literature. Delph and colleagues examined bidirectional relations between tact and listener training. Echoics are an integral part of language learning because much of language is learned by repeating others. Kodak and colleagues found that echoic training can transfer in the success of the acquisition of other verbal operants. Intraverbal responses have been taught to children with autism. Ingvarson and colleagues taught children with autism how to respond to an unfamiliar question with, "I don't know, please tell me," which generalized to untrained settings. Textual verbal behavior can be incorporated in teaching other language skills. Krantz and McClanahan used textual prompts to promote the use of scripts, which led to unscripted verbal interactions. Transcription can be used to supplement teaching other verbal operants. Hebby and colleagues used multiple exemplar instruction for transfer of stimulus function of writing and vocally spelling as an interverbal response, which transferred to untrained sets of words. 3 commonly used language training assessments have been, by behavior analysts, were considered for this study. The first protocol was PEAK, promoting the emergence of advanced knowledge, which assesses a variety of primary language skills and cognitive deficits using Skinner's theory. Direct training and generalization modules were the 2 modules used in this study. PEAK has the most empirical support of the assessment tools that were utilized. Some studies have been done on PEAK using the convergent validity, the effectiveness of the tool, and also IQ increases in correlation with PEAK training. The ABLES-R is the assessment of basic language and learning skills revised, which is a criterion referenced assessment that assesses 25 different skill areas such as language, social interaction, self-help, academic, and motor skills. The ABLES-R has some empirical support on the internal consistency and reliability, content validity and iterator reliability, and convergent validity. The VB map is the verbal behavior milestones assessment and placement program, which is a criterion referenced assessment based on developmental milestones that was created based on Skinner's verbal operant theory. The VB map has little empirical support, but has been widely used as a measurement tool in the literature. There was a study that was completed examining the relationship between PEAK and the VB map, as well as a study completed examining the intraverbal section alone from the protocol. The present study analyzes the content validity of each of these assessments in accordance with Skinner's verbal behavior theory. Content validity assesses the extent of which a measure represents a construct. In this case, the construct is verbal behavior and is composed of Skinner's verbal operants. The purpose is to examine the totality of coverage of all of Skinner's verbal operants that are utilized within each assessment protocol to assess the content validity of each assessment. The current study had 3 phases. The first phase was the identification of primary and extended verbal operants, or the verbal operant categories. 2 PhD level behavior analysts independently developed the VO categories using a PDF of verbal behavior. The list of the primary verbal operants was generated first. IOA was calculated by dividing the total number of agreements by the total number of items found, multiplied by 100, which yielded 90%. The list of extensions was generated next by using the find function within the PDF, using all instances of the operant word, for instance, tact, and instances of extensions were recorded. IOA was calculated the same way as the previous section and yielded 83.3%. Researchers discussed all disagreements and made a decision regarding inclusion or exclusion. The total number of verbal operants found was 63, containing 6 primary and 57 extensions. The next phase was sorting the content items from PEAK, ABLES-R, and VB-MAP into the verbal operant categories. 2 graduate students in behavior analytic programs at 2 universities found definitions for each of the verbal operants. Items on the VB map, ABLES-R, and peak were sorted into verbal operant categories based on the definitions and coded as a corresponding verbal operant. Peak direct training and peak generalization modules were combined because they both utilize Skinner's approach. Receptive items were excluded due to an exclusive interest on expressive language or speaker behavior. IOA was collected for each assessment by dividing the number of agreements total by the number of items multiplied by 100. IOA was taken in a range of 25 to 55%, depending on the assessment due to their varying lengths, and was collected within each section. The VB map and ABLES-R had clear sections that were dedicated to the verbal operants, whereas PEAK did not. So researchers randomly selected throughout the assessment to get the most representative sample of IOA. IOA yielded above 90% for all assessments. The last phase of the procedure was analyzing trends in the coverage of Skinner's theory within the assessments. Two primary dependent variables that were measured were the frequency of distribution of items from each assessment in each verbal operant category, which was computed by dividing the number of times the primary or extension were utilized in the assessment divided by the total number of operants in the category multiplied by 100. The other dependent variable was the totality of Skinner's verbal operant theory by each assessment, which was computed by dividing the number of items considered a primary or an extension by the total number of items on the assessment. And this was repeated with included items as well. Two chi-square tests of independence were computed to examine the relations between the number of verbal operants that were primary or extended with each assessment, as well as the relationship between the number of items dedicated to the primary or extended versions based on the assessment. The results of Figure 1 illustrate how the verbal operants were generally distributed on each assessment. All three assessments used all of the primary verbal operants. However, PEAK utilized the most of the extended verbal operants, followed by the ABLES-R, and the VB map used the least amount of extensions, using only 2 out of 57. Figure 2 indicates the spread of the entire assessment. These results show how much of the entire assessment is dedicated towards the primary or extended verbal operants. The VB map indicates the highest percentage of the entire assessment to the primary verbal operants, and the ABLES-R dedicates the highest percentage of the entire assessment to the extensions. This figure illustrates the same procedure as before, only this graph shows the included items or the expressive items because receptive items were excluded. Of the included items, the VB map dedicates the majority of the assessment to the primary verbal operants, and the ABLES-R dedicates the most to the extensions. And the VB map dedicates the least amount of the assessment to the extensions. Figure 4 demonstrates the number of items each assessment dedicated to each verbal operant. The paper includes the table of the numbered verbal operants. You can see clusters where the assessments cover each of the primary verbal operants. We can also see from this figure that PEAK has the widest spread of coverage for the verbal operants. This figure was computed to give the most accurate picture of how the verbal operants were utilized, because as we've seen before, the ABLES-R had the highest percentage of the assessment dedicated to the extended versions, but this is because of the amount of items that had repeated the same extension several times. But this demonstrates how PEAK utilized the highest spread. The chi-square analysis for the number of verbal operants used by each assessment was not significant. This indicates that the number of verbal operants used by each assessment was not balanced within the general distribution of the assessment. The chi-square analysis for the number of items dedicated to the verbal operant categories was significant, indicating there is an imbalance within the assessment for distribution of items, which differs from the assumption that the verbal operant categories should be equally covered. In summary, the VB map dedicated the majority of the assessment to the primary verbal operants, and the ABLES-R dedicated the least to the primary verbal operants. The ABLES-R dedicated the majority of the assessment to the extensions, whereas the VB map dedicated the least amount of the assessment to the extensions. All three assessments covered all of the primary verbal operants. Peak utilized the highest percentage of all the verbal operants, and the VB map utilized the lowest amount of the total verbal operants. Figure 4 best illustrates how each verbal operant was distributed within the assessment. Implications of the present study outlines the lack of coverage of Skinner's verbal behavior theory in commonly used language assessments. This study outlines how any of these assessments could be used to assess the primary verbal operants. However, Peak provides the most comprehensive account of assessing complex language skills. An important implication for practitioners is that these assessments lack the total scope of the base theory, and in turn, interventions may lack in scope as well. A controversial implication of this study may indicate that Skinner's analysis is not enough to account for human language learning, and newer technologies should combine for a more robust account of language learning. There are limitations within this study, including Skinner's definitions of the verbal operants have been attempted to be translated into measurable variables. Critchfield and Reed noted that reverse translating qualitative data into quantitative data can be difficult to capture. Another limitation is the assumption that each assessment should have an equal spread of verbal operant categories, because each assessment had varying coverage of the verbal operants, and because they were not all equal, a comparison between them is difficult. Avenues of future research should attempt to develop an equation to reverse translate these qualitative data into quantitative data. Another avenue to address the imbalance in the assessments would be to instead calculate the amount of text that Skinner dedicated to each verbal operant, rather than the assumption of equal spread by verbal operant categories. There is more text coverage on the primary verbal operants because they play a more central role in the base theory. A literature review could be conducted to review the most common verbal operants being used currently in the field to generate a focus on the most central or more important verbal operants. Another avenue for future research could be to combine Skinner's verbal operant theory with newer technologies such as relational frame theory to account for a more robust theory of language learning and how complex language is formed. The present study could be extended by utilizing the remaining 2 modules of Peak to test a synthesis of Skinner's verbal operants in combination with relational frame theory. In summary, the content validity with these assessments is lacking based on Skinner's theory. Peak covers the widest variety of verbal operants and may be the best protocol to assess the verbal operant categories. However, the totality of Skinner's theory is covered less than 25% in these commonly used tools. Skinner's theory may be better supplemented with newer technologies such as RFT using derived relational responding. If you have questions or comments, leave them below and I will respond as soon as possible. I'd like to thank you again for agreeing to be on my committee and providing support and feedback throughout this process. Thank you.